So previously we went over Dragon Ball Z's best and worst animated episode, and I thought it was only proper to now go over Super's this time, and again review the animation, but also the general quality of the artwork, storyboard and direction. This should be a lot of fun. We'll be discussing Super's Ebisawa equivalent, but also going over some exceptionally skilled animators, some of who you can find all the way back on Z like Naotoshi Shida. So, hope you enjoy. Now, my pick for one of the best animated episodes, I would have to go with 130, and the worst would be episode 24. Now already I can physically sense a multitude of hands ready to type away and say, but what about episode 5? Well, episode 5, unlike 24, featured a stack of corrections for the Blu-ray release of the show, and so there's a decent amount of great drawings throughout both the first and second half now. And in the animation department, you had key animator Ken Otsuka and industry veteran still managed to put out a decent scene. It's certainly not noteworthy in comparison to his resume of work on both this series and others, but still considering the massive time crunch this episode had, it's fine. Naoki Tate, another veteran who's been with this franchise since the 80s, put out a nice scene as well. For whatever reason, people still to this day blame him for that episode, as if he animated the entire thing, even though there are up to 18 key animators credited. And what's even more odd is the fact that the blame for not just this episode, but oftentimes when you have cases of an episode falling apart in a series, is for the blame to be shifted entirely on the animators and not the producers, who are often responsible for creating these scenarios, which I mean couldn't make more sense. Like, why not pin it entirely on the animators being lazy? I mean, yeah, it's common for them to fall asleep at their desk due to exhaustion, and also to the point of being admitted to hospitals, and yeah, their wages sit below Japan's poverty line, so they're definitely the guys to go after. Make sure you harass them on Twitter, it makes them feel like they're back in the office, definitely the way to solve it. But anyway, sarcasm aside, back to 24. In its case, there is just nothing of note animation and artwork wise, again in comparison to 5. Like, this was Super's schedule at its worst, which I've brought up many times was largely as a result of producers setting incredibly unrealistic deadlines as they wanted to fill Kai's time slot and capitalize on the timing with Resurrection F. So to put it simply, they created an environment for animators and many other staff in general to not be able to do their job properly. But hey, in this review, let's start with some positivity and go over one of the franchise's best animated episodes this time, 130. Now the credits list is packed with talented staff from both veterans and newcomers to the franchise. You have classic animators like Naotoshi Shida, Tetsuya Saeki, who belonged to the same studio as Shida on Z, Naoki Tate, and Toshiyuki Kano was even brought in, with this being his only episode on Super. And of course, you have other new talents to the series like Sir, Futoshi Higashide, Ken Otsuka, and many more. Now on the directional front, the series director himself, Ryota Nakamura, handles this episode as well as the storyboard. Although his colourful direction is certainly amazing, that isn't his greatest skill. He mentioned prior to the airing of this episode that even before this arc he had been wanting to improve the quality of the visuals compared to earlier in the series. And that's a desire certainly not unique to Nakamura, especially among a staff list made up of hardcore Dragon Ball fans himself. But it's another thing to achieve that and have a production punch far above its weight. And this episode serves as one of the best displays of Nakamura succeeding in that. Episodes like this don't magically come about because of a sole factor like budget or because one famous animator stepped in, especially with a production as messy as Super's. Instead, it's through the skill of smart management done leading up to this episode, and one that Nakamura clearly used. But now to the episode itself. So right away we have Naoki Tate, also the animation supervisor for the first half. Naturally you have his more simple line work and shading, moving away from the more blocky look to the character sheets, with a chief AD correction by an uncredited Tadayoshi Yamamuro, who is popping up all over these episodes uncredited. His style may be completely different than Tate's, but for a still it's fitting and looks fine. Anyways, to Tate's animation. Firstly, I love the amount of speed to his movements and the detail of the aftershock as Goku shoots past. It starts off on 2s and quickly changes to 1s with some very wide spacing, certainly not surprising for a former Sega Astra animator. And his effects work features a variety of stylish shapes, but the hand-to-hand combat begins and he takes his familiar, looser approach. His emphasis on movements is especially good. For example, as Jiren launches off, he doesn't just instantly go forward, he winds up then launches off. And so even without dialogue and sound, you can still sense his frustration just from his body language. Of course, these are your general animation fundamentals in play, but it's still nice to see. Tate additionally sells him as the bulky character he is through the length of the pauses between each hit as well as the poses themselves. In general, this whole scene has a lot of flair to the portrayal of movement, and the cut as Jiren charges up a key attack is a great example of that. Definitely one of my favourite scenes from him on Super. And soon after, you can see Nakamura's direction really sticking out. The framing of Goku surrounded by flames, the extreme long shot and the colour of the flames holds depth and simply looks cool. Atsushi Nikaido then follows up after Tate, putting out some of his top work on the series. The complex camera work, non-stop barrage of cool effects, and the amount of force behind these attacks does a superb job in communicating the high level of intensity to this battle. And although you can definitely see Tate's corrections popping up here and there, Nikaido's style still shines and he really puts out some great drawings. Tate also finishes off the scene with all the traits as mentioned before, and he likewise can animate some pretty powerful blows. But after some dialogue with Tate and Suji's corrections all over the place, Jiren powers up and Nakamura's color pick with drenching the environment in these dark red tones plays into this ever-building tension and gives weight to Jiren's desperation as the entire stage is engulfed in flames. There are so many distinctive shots in this board, and is another reason why this episode looks as good as it does. Then Jiren launches at Goku, and you might be led to think that this is Tate's at first glance with how heavy these corrections are, but this is Kyuyong-seo, and much in line with what we've seen so far, there's a lot of emphasis on strong movement, and his scene is likewise filled with great character art. I particularly like the more slimmer face he gives Goku and his sharper take on facial features in general. His timing is additionally quite stylish. But that's the first half over, now to the second. So I haven't mentioned him yet, but the supervisor here for this portion is Shuichiro Manabe, and it's key animator Kenji Miyuma who's up next. You have big punches and excellent effects work. Like everyone else so far, he doesn't hold back. Not too soon later, going off the wide nose, I'm guessing this is where Toshiyuki Kano's part begins. The following character art of UI Goku likewise has a very similar shape to the way he would draw ears back on Z. It is short and certainly a little conservative in comparison to many of the other action animators, but it features some nice camera work. Then not too soon later, there's a flashback, and I remember back even when I first watched this episode in 2018, back when I had no idea who these animators were, I really loved how there was an attempt to stick to the older designs of that period when drawing these scenes. Even then, it was a little jarring for me personally how, whenever it came to reanimated flashbacks like in episode 16, they would lean to the show's current style, like those more thinner arms rather than the chubby look of that era, or with drawings for like the Kai eye catches or new covers for the movie re-releases, how again they would match it more towards Yamamura's post-Buu arc style. And of course here it's not a one-to-one recreation in all shots, but it's still nice and I appreciate not having highlights all over the place. I am aware that it's being presumed that Futoshi Higashide animated the silhouettes, but I'm unsure about the recap animation. Two cuts were reused from episode 75, with Nakamura directing that one interestingly, using the exact same composition but this time adding some appropriate flair. Higashide is also credited on that episode, so who knows. Anyway, what we do know is that he handles the scene thereafter. Higashide was one of the top regular animators on Super, and as is the trend, he does not hold back. A plethora of effects, complex movements, and dynamic poses is what you get from him. I particularly like the cut with all the crazy flips Goku does just before he hits Jiren. It takes me back to episode 179 by Studio Cockpit. And I guess another Z throwback for me is as Jiren launches that attack at everyone with the palette switching to those purple tones, definitely was giving me some Ueda vibes. But not too soon after, you of course have the man himself, Naotoshi Shida. Shida, thanks to the respect that he's garnered over the years by many staff at Toei, has allowed him to get away with doing what he likes, completely breaking away from the character sheets on Super, and just about any show he's worked on, and like you would expect, that's no different here. His sharp indented cheek shading alongside those thin, narrow eyes harkens back to Z's old designs, while also being fresh and unique with his more triangular shape design. And like always, Shida tackles dozens of complex angles, all while animating a multitude of effects in such an effortless way. From the punches to facial expressions, everything has this aggressive touch which truly lives up to being the big climax of the episode. But you also have another great animator in his own right, Ken Otsuka, finish it off with likewise some great intense expressions. Once again, I really like seeing that slightly more angular and slimmer style to Goku's face, so that's another plus. Outside of that, there isn't anything animation-wise left to mention outside of Miyuma's effects work, which is very detailed and impactful. Although before wrapping up, I once again have to praise Nakamura's direction. Within that moment, Goku first starts to feel the effects of all this power, with everything switching to just red outlines against a flat black background. It instantly grabs your attention and paired with his excellent music placement, really brings a sense of drama and surprise. But with that, to the summary. So overall, this is an episode where every department not only hits the mark, but goes far beyond and delivers something quite unexpected. This was an incredibly ambitious episode, and I can't stress enough how difficult this must have been when considering what a rough schedule this series began with, and so to pull off something as bombastic as this speaks to their hard work. Also, on a side note, I absolutely love the tracks Nakamura picked as well as their placement, and although both Falconer and Kikuchi, the two names you'll always hear whenever soundtrack discussions erupt, and who I both equally love, Sumitomo is really underrated I think by the fandom, and is great in his own right. But now it's time to switch over to episode 24, which serves as a good example of how bad Super Schedule really was, and how far the series had come. But anyway, this was supervised by two guys, Akira Kano, who seems to be a bit of a mystery in terms of what his actual style is, as he was always paired up with other supervisors and contributed key animations on a whopping 1 episode, and has credits on 2 movies and on Heroes ones. And yeah, that's really it, so a bit of a hard one to assess. And the other is the man himself, Yukihiro Kintano. It's kinda hard to describe Kintano because as an animator and supervisor is a bit of a mix to begin with, but as soon as heavy time constraints come in, it's just a massive drop across the board. And I'll also point out that even though Kintano certainly isn't the greatest animator, his work here is partly the result of fatigue. He had just recently worked on episode 18 and contributed a notable amount of animation there, to then, with no break, had to pretty much solo animate the very next episode. And after that was then placed on the big action episode of this arc, episode 24, which naturally requires far more animation, thus drawings and thus time, again supervising and providing more key animation. I'm honestly surprised this man didn't disintegrate at his desk. So as much as I joke around about him, the last impression I would want to give is that he is lazy. But moving on, there is also the chief animation supervisor Miyako Tsuji. Now the storyboard was handled by 2 separate people. It's a common practice for the episode director to handle the storyboard, and that when these roles are split, it can be indicative of time constraints. But the fact that it's split among 2 people really again shows how hectic the production was just from credits alone. Anyways, you had Toshiaki Kimura and Takahiro Imamura. Now, Kimura is definitely one of Super's lesser known storyboard artists and directors, partly due to being involved in only a handful of episodes, and generally with his work being pretty standard with some highlights here and there throughout his episodes. Imamura, on the other hand, came onto the franchise back on Z, and was pretty active as an assistant supervisor and episode director. He has credits on a lot of the classic films and directed and storyboarded several important episodes such as 219, but especially ones like 286 concluding the battle with Majin Buu and the final episode of the series 291. And very much like on Z, his output isn't all too consistent, but we'll get to that soon enough. Then finally there's Hideki Hiroshima. Now his debut on the franchise was all the way back with Path to Power in '96, although despite that being his only contribution on the franchise pre-Super, he's quite active on the show with credits on up to 19 episodes. However, as is the trend, his work likewise is occasionally noteworthy. But with the credits out of the way, let's dive in. So the first couple of seconds actually caught me off guard because it was simply fine, and for a brief moment I began to reconsider how bad this episode was, until about 15 seconds in, and yeah, the artwork takes a steep dive. But to give a little bit of praise, because that's going to be hard going forward, the storyboard in the very first cut delivers on giving a good sense of scale, and although I have no idea who the key animator was for this portion, it seems it was pretty heavily corrected by Miyako Tsuji, and again looks fine. Going forward, it's hard to determine whose work is whose, considering part of this episode was outsourced to Toei Fills, who make up half of the key animation staff list, and I have no idea what their style looks like. Although you can see Kintano's corrections come in, he has a tendency to give characters like Goku small eyes and small mouths and wide heads. You can see Tsuji's corrections come up again and again throughout this scene, but it really is patchwork as the rest of the art here gradually worsens. And this of course creates quite a fluctuation in quality, like you'll have this shot here by Tsuji which looks great, then in the following cuts you'll have work that looks like this. And like you would expect, the animation of what there is naturally takes a hit. The first walk cycle looks off with how Goku's foot slides across the background and generally feels stiff, then Kintano steps up for the portion as Goku and Frieza clash, and there's simply no weight behind the hits as it's mostly just stills with camera shake and some blur effects added. The following hits feature slightly more movement but come off incredibly rigid thanks to the poses and lack of anticipation, like there's barely any build up behind it. But hey, credit where credit is due, at least unlike with episode 89, they get to the action pretty much straight away, like there isn't endless staring and dialogue for 7 minutes. Anyway, within this struggle, there's probably one of my favorite shots of Goku in the episode. I like the variation in the line work, it gives some nice depth, the expression looks fierce, and the nose actually has curvature, unfortunately a rarity in this era thanks to the character designer Tadayoshi Yamamuro. But I have no idea who did it, and I'll admit I'm not overly familiar with Tsuji's work, but that is not how she draws noses. It looks like something out of the Namek arc, and those eyes look partly like Kintano, so I'm clueless there. In the following scenes, there's kinda nothing to point out. It's just dialogue with Tsuji and Kintano trying to correct what they can. We flick back to Goku and Frieza and they're still just struggling. The animation sorta sells that. Hiroyuki Atai then steps in soon enough. Now, Atai was a regular on Super and later would be promoted to an animation supervisor, but his animation typically would be average at best. But again, thanks to heavy time constraints, it takes quite a hit. The first punch feels pretty weightless, partly again due to the rigid poses, but more so with the lack of just general follow through. I'm kinda surprised he didn't just mask it with a bunch of camera shake like you could see animators do back in Z. Anyway, as Goku flies back, he uses the same pose and it simply looks awkward. Maybe if it was a comedy scene, it would have worked, but here, not so much. And yeah, that pretty much sums up Atai's scene. It looks quite jerky and generally uninteresting. The only competent bit of animation this section has is the character acting with Jacko. But not too soon after, you have a complete style shift. I'm unsure who did this, but I really like the look. The highlights are gone, the line work has a rough and uneven touch, somewhat like the filter that was applied in Dragon Ball Super Broly. Now the drawings aren't all perfect, but all things considered it's nice, pity it's short-lived. Now not too soon after, you have the classic scene of Goku getting swung around by, of course, Kintano. And honestly, the art speaks for itself, and you can see how rushed this part was with how he's missed lines around Frieza's armor here, and how rough and uneven the line work is for his tail. Kintano was just desperately scribbling out drawings at this point. Now to the animation itself, the major reason it feels so awkward is because you have just like one limb moving while the whole body remains still, and the general timing isn't exactly good either, giving quite an unnatural look. And honestly, looking back, whoever storyboarded this scene perhaps shouldn't have chosen a full body shot with two characters when considering the obvious time constraints, and instead focused on perhaps different parts of the body to make it easier and quicker to animate, like this scene here in Dragon Ball Z by Ebisawa. Now there was also an odd choice to have Goku and Frieza exchanging dialogue while holding each other and floating in the air. It simply feels odd, especially since it goes on for quite a bit. However, it's unfortunately finished off by incredibly limited animation for the major move, so to say. It's just stills with camera shake, kinda to be expected at this point though. We then get to some more groundbreaking action, some loop strikes, certainly nothing new to the series. And hey, at least they actually changed up the attacks. Again, it's not 81 and Z where it's just like 4 different cuts of the exact same action with not a single variation. Now getting close to the end of the first half, the artwork manages to worsen more than before, reaching Ebisawa levels of crazy proportions. And some of the poses are completely broken, and I mean literally. Now of course, breaking joints in animation to achieve more flexibility works fine in motion. It's a practice that's been done for decades. However, for a still, not exactly the best. The only thing I can honestly praise in this section again is the storyboard. The choreography though is obviously lacking. But again, there's some nice angles. I particularly like this one with the curvilinear perspective. Now getting on to the second half, Vegeta has stepped in at this point. There's a nice smear or two as he's telling off Goku, so that's something. The fight with Vegeta is very jerky like everything we've seen, although you can spot a couple of okay poses if you look hard enough, and that thick line work pops up for a couple of frames, so maybe it's just a random stylistic choice by Kintano. But still, there isn't anything to detail here that I haven't brought up already, although it is worth pointing out that the general quality of artwork is a little better than the first half, thanks to Tsuji. But I guess we may as well get to the reveal of SSB. And as no surprise, since this is a new transformation, not technically, but in the TV series of course, naturally Tsuji's corrections dominate. Some rough stuff slips through here and there, but it's reasonably on model like you would expect. The effects work looks good. I quite like the choice to use that chalky brush for the lightning, and even though the animation and drawings aren't up to par to its movie counterpart, which is granted considering it's a movie which naturally has a far different production than a TV series, the framing and the storyboard I personally think did a better job than Yamamuro's, who of course storyboarded Resurrection F, so good job there. This whole scene, however, I think best illustrates the lack of consistency the best. You go from Tsuji's Goku to this, then to this shot of Krillin in a completely different style with that bold line work again. And I guess a minor detail before we finish off is that in the photography stage, one of the artists forgot to composite Goku's arm and belt sash. so you have those rough pixelated lines, and they also forgot to erase the line here. Definitely not a big deal though. But I guess to summarize all the departments, starting with the director Hiroshima, who I haven't discussed yet, and that's because there really was literally nothing noteworthy. His music placement was fine, but yeah, that's really it. As we clearly saw, much like 89, this is a great example of when an episode lacks both time and talent, and every department falls flat, with perhaps exception to the storyboard. For the supervisors and animators, Tsuji did what she could, Kintano's work is at its lowest, and who knows what Akira Kano did. But to leave on a good note, I think looking at how the staff managed to pull off an arc like the Tournament of Power that centered around action non-stop, when they struggled so much with action episodes in the early days, again speaks of their hard work. But with that though, brings us to the end. Hope you enjoyed, and I thank you for watching to the end. And with that, I'll see you later.